Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that highlights some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also focuses on their history, their culture, and their geopolitics. And today we are moving into a new thematic area. At long last, we have spent several weeks now covering countries under the thematic area of Islam's fault line. Today, we are moving into another, which is called Times of Joy and Times of Sorrow. And we are going to begin this thematic area with a supremely interesting country in Europe that is well known to all of us, but that has a level of complexity that I think is quite interesting, and hopefully you will find it fascinating. So I want to share some observations with you today about the country of Germany. I've been to Germany on several occasions, and I remember each and every one of them fondly. But that being said, I will tell you that Germany didn't treat me gently. I'll give you an example. In Berlin, in March of 2023, I landed in a blizzard so thick that it erased the runway until the moment the wheels slammed into it. The plane skidded sideways, snow was hammering the fuselage like 1,000 thrown stones. And for just a moment, I wondered if this was how my story in Germany would begin or end. I was flying in to attend a major tourism show that was being hosted by my friends from the Republic of Georgia, who I had worked with for many years. And so I flew into Berlin as their guest to spend time with them and to highlight the beautiful country of Georgia on the world stage. But the weather was just atrocious. But that's Germany. It has a way of confronting you directly even before you've stepped off the jet bridge at the airport. But that wasn't even the real test on that trip. The real test came next, and that was the drive from Berlin to Leipzig down the Autobahn. We were swallowed up by a whiteout almost immediately. I was with a North Macedonian driver who shrugged at the storm like it was a mild inconvenience and then pushed us into it, all the time discussing his experiences as an expatriate in the country. Trucks were jackknifed, cars spun out. He literally didn't slow down the entire time. He tore down the Autobahn toward Leipzig as if there wasn't any snow at all, even though the road vanished and reappeared like a mirage. It was a harrowing sprint through a country that survived far worse winters, both in reality and political, ideological, and existential. But Leipzig, of course, which was a major city in Eastern Europe when the country was petitioned, offered a brief pause, a breath before the next surreal chapter. The train back to Berlin cut through a landscape that looked more like a charcoal sketch than a nation. Villages half buried in snow, forests blurred into smudges, passengers wrapped in silence that felt almost ceremonial. Watching the countryside pass, I thought about how many times this land has been remade, sometimes by choice and sometimes by force. Back in Berlin, of course, I went to the tourism show. I spent time with my friends from the Republic of Georgia. I got to interact with other friends from around the world in countries where I've served. But I also had the opportunity to wander through the vestiges of both World War II and the Cold War, visiting things like the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, which was heavily damaged by Allied bombing and today is a museum and art gallery. the Berlin Wall, and of course the ultra touristy Checkpoint Charlie. But Germany's story isn't just snowstorm skylines and nostalgia. Germany's story includes shadows as well. And those times of laughter and joy that I had in Leipzig and Berlin were quickly swallowed up by times in Bavaria where I was overcome with the sorrow of Germany's very checkered history. For instance, I made the pilgrimage to Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp, the prototype for a system of industrialized cruelty. The air there just felt heavy, as if memory itself had weight. The gravel crunched under my feet, the barracks stood in muted rows, and the crematorium sat at the edge of the grounds like a wound that never fully closed. Walking through Dachau was not a visit, it was an encounter, a confrontation with what human beings are capable of when ideology replaces empathy. And that encounter followed me across a border because some months later in Poland, I stood on the frozen earth of Auschwitz Birkenau. I've talked about my visit to Auschwitz Birkenau before, but it's a place so vast, so meticulously engineered for death that the mind struggles to hold on to it. I remember very vividly one of my visits there when I made the transition from Auschwitz to Auschwitz II, which is called Birkenau. Came over on a shuttle bus. And as the bus pulled up, we were ushered through the entry into Auschwitz II Birkenau along the railroad track that would have led the railroad cars in. And I remember standing there with a group of tourists, and we had an amazing guide. And our guide gave us a little bit of an overview of Birkenau, and then she stopped and said, this is a very large group, and so I have a colleague here who is with me, and we're going to divide this group up. And she said, all of you who are over 55 years old, step over here. All of you who are non-Aryan, step over here. Sir, I see that you're walking with a cane. Why don't you step over here as well? And when she was done, she said, all right, this group, which was the younger, more fit, Aryan-looking group, she said, you go with my colleague. And then she looked at the group that I was in and said, and this group, follow me because I'm taking you directly to the gas chamber. This was a very poignant reminder of what the selection process was in Nazi Germany. Even though we were in Poland, the vestiges of Germany were all over that place, and especially the Nazi mentality of the final solution. And I realized that had I come in the early to mid 1940s on a boxcar, I would have been separated into the group that would have been taken directly to the gas chamber. And a weight of sorrow fell on me at that time that is almost indescribable. Even some 80 years later, that feeling of grief and that feeling of anger and that feeling of sorrow still permeates that place. The watchtowers, the endless rows of barracks, the railway line that delivered more than 1 million souls to their final moments. The silence there at Auschwitz and Auschwitz II Birkenau is different from Dachau's. It's not heavy, it's hollow, as if the land itself is trying to comprehend what happened to it. Those experiences didn't stay contained to memory. Actually, they became stories. When, on every occasion when I left one of those concentration camps, whether it was in Germany, like Dachau, or Poland, Auschwitz, Auschwitz II Birkenau, I later that day or the next day, I began writing down a concept for stories that I wanted to tell. And these concepts became 3 novels: An Ode to Joy, A Woman with No Country, and Clara's Choice. Here they are right here. An Ode to Joy, A Woman with No Country, and Clara's Choice. These 3 novels that I wrote based on the feelings and emotions that I got at these camps were my attempts to explore the emotional, moral, and historical realities of World War II Germany. Each book is its own reckoning, its own way of trying to understand how ordinary people navigated extraordinary darkness. And all 3 are now available on Amazon for readers who want to walk those roads with me. But Germany had additional surprises, additional reminders that history is never just one thing. For instance, in Bavaria, there was another moment, an unexpected moment, a surreal moment. I was in Munich when church bells erupted in a ceaseless, jubilant roar. I was taking a walk through the main square, and all of a sudden church bells began chiming everywhere, over and over. And word spread quickly. A new pope had been chosen, Pope Leo, an American. The bells rang and rang, echoing off centuries-old stone, filling beer gardens and market squares with the kind of ancient joy. It was a moment that felt both timeless and startlingly modern. A reminder that Germany's story is never just Germany's story. It's woven into the world. And I remember as I walked back to the hotel from that square with the bell still chiming, a friend of mine who was across the street at my hotel saw me coming and began yelling, "The Pope's an American! The Pope's an American!" in jubilation. It was a very fond memory that I have. One of those times of joy that fits into our thematic area. But Germany is a land of tensions, and that's what we're exploring today. A nation that defined the 20th century through war, division, reconstruction, and reunification. Now navigating the complexities of the 21st century, European leadership, energy politics, NATO commitments, demographic shifts, and the long shadow of a past that demands remembrance. From blizzards to bells, from autobahns to ashes, from personal journeys to published novels, Germany is a place where the past is always present and the future is always pressing in. If there was ever a country with which to begin the thematic area of times of joy and times of sorrow, it's Germany. My work and travels there gave me such joy at times, but also immersed me in a vat of sorrow from which it was hard to climb out. This is some stops along the way, and today we're stopping in Germany. Germany is really a country made of memory. It's a country that forces the world to remember. Remember the heights of philosophy and music. Remember the depths of human cruelty. Remember the walls, both the ones it built and the ones it tore down. So today we're going to walk through the German 20th century, a century that Germany didn't just live through, but shaped, a century that broke it, rebuilt it, divided it, and ultimately transformed it into one of the most stable democracies on earth. This is the story of how a nation can fall apart and how it can rise again. Of course, Germany has a long and storied history, tracing back to ancient civilizations. And it would take so much time to cover that history that really I've decided not to do that. We're going to pick up in the early part of the 20th century and explore, first of all, the road to World War I. Germany, as we know it today, is a relatively young country. It was unified only in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck. It was a rising industrial powerhouse, confident, ambitious, and insecure all at once. And those were the three forces that shaped its path to World War I. Forces such as rapid industrialization, militarism, and, of course, a volatile Kaiser. Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck and pursued an aggressive foreign policy. Germany wasn't destined for war, but it was primed for miscalculation. And that led to the domino effect. And when the dominoes began to fall, they fell quickly. And the first domino to fall was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. That's what lit the fuse for World War I. Of course, that assassination didn't happen in Germany. It happened in what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina. As a matter of fact, it happened in Sarajevo, where I lived for quite some time. And I've stood on the bridge where Franz Ferdinand and his wife crossed just before they were assassinated. As a matter of fact, I was appointed by the mayor of Sarajevo to the 100th anniversary commemorative committee of that assassination. Who would have known at that time that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife would turn out to be a major causatory factor in, at that time, the biggest war that Europe had ever seen. Germany issued the infamous blank check to Austria-Hungary, believing a quick war would strengthen its global position. But instead, it triggered catastrophe. World War I was a war of attrition. Germany fought on two fronts. It bled itself dry. It watched its morale collapse. And by 1918, the Kaiser abdicated. The empire fell. A fragile republic was born. And what happened next laid the foundation for the second, even more debilitating war in Europe. Of course, that was World War II. Because the treaty that Germany signed at the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, which, by the way, was signed on the day that my mother was born in 1918, that treaty punished Germany with territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars today. It literally debilitated the German economy. It was catastrophic for Germany, politically, economically, but most damaging was its effect psychologically on the German people. Germany had to accept sole guilt for the war, and the humiliation became political fuel. It was that economic hardship, that political vacuum, and that humiliation that gave rise to the Weimar Republic. Hyperinflation in 1923 destroyed savings overnight. Political violence erupted between the communist and right wing militias. Democracy felt weak, temporary, foreign. And into this chaos stepped a failed artist with a talent for rage. His name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler and his Nazi movement promised national pride, economic revival, revenge for Versailles, and a purified German identity. The Germans were embarrassed. They were economically ruined. And so the decisions made in punishing Germany so severely for World War I actually laid the groundwork for Hitler's control of the government and ultimately laid the foundation for World War II. With all these other factors in play, it was the Great Depression that actually sealed the deal. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. And within months of him taking over the government, democracy in Germany was dead. Hitler immediately began to rebuild the military. He annexed neighbors. He launched the invasion of Poland in 1939. Germany's early victories were stunning. France fell in 6 weeks. Their Blitzkrieg war began to topple one country after another in Europe. But Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 opened a front that he couldn't sustain. In some ways, I think Hitler underestimated the Soviets. When he declared war and invaded the Soviet Union, I'm not sure that Hitler had a grasp of a couple very important things. Number one, Russia's resolve. The fact that they didn't care how many soldiers they lost in war. They were going to hold their territory. And of course, the Soviets lost more than 1 million soldiers in that debilitating World War II. But Hitler it was a morass for Hitler. He bogged down in Russia. And that led to a second miscalculation, and that is a war on two fronts. Bogged down in Russia, then he had to focus his attention westward on England. And of course, after December 7th, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan. They also declared war on Germany. This laid the foundation for the D-Day invasion, June 6th, 1944. When, with the Americans' help, the Allies were able ultimately to retake Europe. A series of miscalculations on Hitler's part. The fact that he ignored his major advisors, he surrounded himself with people who would tell him what he wanted to hear versus what was real. And those that told him what was real, such as General Erwin Rommel in North Africa, ended up either marginalized or, in Rommel's case, dead by suicide. Germany had many opportunities to finish off the war in Europe. At Dunkirk, for instance, where they didn't seize the initiative. On the Russian front, where their lack of aggressiveness and even the weather turned against them. And so the trajectory of the war by 1944 began to slip away. But all during this time, Hitler had another agenda as well. And that is the rise of the Aryan state. The purification, in his mind, of the German people. And this led to what is known as the Holocaust. 6 million Jews murdered. Millions of others, Roma, disabled people, political dissidents, LGBTQ Germans, all targeted for extermination in camps like the ones I mentioned before, and many others throughout Germany and throughout the area that Germany controlled at that time. The Holocaust wasn't a side effect of war. It was a central goal of the Nazi state. The final solution, the purification of the German people, the ascension of the German people to both political and ethnic dominance. And a grave miscalculation and a grave stain on the German people. Of course, we all know the end of this story. By 1945, Germany was in ruins. Hitler was dead in his bunker in Berlin. The Allies occupied the country. And then came the next fracture. The interesting thing is, after World War II, the Allies took a very different approach to the reestablishment of order in Europe, with the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, to ease off on the type of punishment and humiliation that had led Germany down the path to World War II. But even so, the effects of World War II on Germany created both economic and psychological hardships that led it to become the front line of the Cold War. Because you see, once Germany was vanquished in World War II, then competing interests took over. The Soviets wanted their piece of the pie. The Americans and other allies wanted their piece of the pie. And what came out of that was a fractured Germany, a divided Germany between West Germany, which was democratic, capitalist, and aligned with the United States and Western allies, and East Germany, called GDR, which was communist, authoritarian, and controlled by the USSR. Berlin, deep inside Germany, was split in half. There is an amazing book called 1961 that outlines the devolution of Germany in general, but Berlin in specific, into the chaos that eventually ended with the construction of the Berlin Wall. And it talks extensively in that book about the antagonizing forces, the communist installed government in Eastern Europe, the Soviets, President Kennedy, who was the leader of the Western Bloc. All of that converged into this toxic cocktail that led in 1961 to the East German regime building the Berlin Wall. Families were divided, lives were frozen. The wall became a symbol of the entire Cold War. And while the wall was a symbol, in reality, there were two Germanys and two realities. West Germany boomed. It was an economic miracle, while East Germany stagnated. It became efficient in surveillance and inefficient in everything else. But history has a way of surprising even the most rigid systems. In 1961, when the Berlin Wall was built, it was a manifestation of everything that had gone wrong. It was a manifestation of the Cold War, the visible symbol of the Cold War, or of the Iron Curtain, so to speak. There were pundits that believed it would last into perpetuity. No one could see a day when the Berlin Wall would come down and where the USSR, which controlled the government of East Germany, would fracture. But for a lot of different reasons that we don't have time to go into in this podcast, it happened. On November 9th, 1989, a confused spokesman announced that travel restrictions were lifted immediately. Crowds surged to the checkpoints. Guards, overwhelmed, opened the gates. And the wall, the symbol of division, fell in a single night. I remember hearing then President Ronald Reagan utter those famous words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." And this tripartite leadership of Reagan, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Mikhail Gorbachev in the USSR, together did what pundits had said for years since the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 was impossible. And it happened so quickly. I think, even though I was young then, I saw the trends. But no one was prepared for the Berlin Wall, the most obvious manifestation of the Cold War, to fall in one night. Not long after that, on October 3rd, 1990, Germany officially reunited. But as with most things in Germany, it wasn't as simple as that. The East economy collapsed. Billions were spent on rebuilding. Cultural divides lingered. And quite frankly, they still linger to this day. I remember when I took that trip to Leipzig, which was a major city in East Germany during the Cold War. I walked into my hotel, and in the lobby of the hotel was a Trabant, which was an East German made car. They still to this day, they call it the worst car ever built. It was cheap, but it was a piece of trash. Now, there are Trabant clubs. They're collector's items now. They're worth 5, 10, 15, 20 times more now than you could have bought one new for during the Cold War. But Leipzig was the city where many of the Tremonts were built. And so it was an overt manifestation in the lobby of my hotel of a significant symbol, if you will, of the Cold War. But once that unification took place and this rebuilding of East Germany's economy began, the country started taking on a new identity. And it's an identity that's built on three pillars: democracy, memory, and restraint. Germany today is Europe's largest economy, but it's cautious in its military affairs. It's a leader in the European Union, but reluctant to dominate. It's a nation that carries its past like a weight and a responsibility. And one of the reasons for this is its recent leadership. And you can't really talk about Germany's emergence as an economic power in Europe post Berlin Wall, post 1989, without talking about the chancellorship of Angela Merkel. Frau Merkel's tenure coincided with nearly every existential crisis that the European Union faced: the global financial crash, the Eurozone debt crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, Russia's aggression, the COVID-19 pandemic. And her leadership style, pragmatic, incremental, crisis driven, became synonymous with the EU survival strategy. Let's look at some of these crises that Chancellor Merkel addressed while in office. And remember, she was no political novice. She worked her way up through the system. She was mentored by some very astute German leaders. And when she became chancellor, she came into the office ready to lead from day one. She didn't always make the right decisions. I think history bears that out. But she made decisions that positioned Germany in a way that continues to drive it today. She faced, as I said before, the Eurozone debt crisis. And she became Europe's stabilizer. This crisis lasted from 2009 to 2015, and it was really a defining moment for her leadership, because Germany insisted on fiscal discipline, austerity, and structural reforms for the bailout of recipients such as Greece. Some in Europe were calling on the European Union to just let Greece go, that it was a lost cause. But Chancellor Merkel rejected that and helped navigate a system of fiscal discipline that allowed Greece to remain in the European Union. She ultimately supported rescue packages to keep Greece and others inside the Eurozone, despite not only opposition from within Europe, but within her own country. And that created significant impact. In fact, many credit her with saving the euro and preventing EU fragmentation. But critics argue that austerity deepened social hardship in Southern Europe. Regardless of which ideological side you fall on, what happened during the Eurozone debt crisis was historically significant. And Angela Merkel's decisions cemented Germany as the EU's indispensable economic leader, a role that it had avoided up to that time. Chancellor Merkel also had very specific views on migration and asylum. In 2015, the migration crisis really took hold in Europe, and it was another defining moment for Angela Merkel. She opened Germany's borders to refugees, famously declaring, "Wir schaffen das." We can manage this. This positioned Germany as the moral center of Europe, but it also triggered political backlash across the continent. The migration crisis exposed structural flaws in the Dublin regulation, which placed disproportionate burden on frontline states. Merkel pushed for an EU-wide burden sharing, though many states resisted. By the late 2010s, Germany, like much of Europe, moved towards stricter border controls and security-focused migration policies. And the reason it did this is because there was I think history records, a fundamental flaw in Chancellor Merkel's "we can manage this" policy. The refugees came in too big in numbers without the proper vetting and regulation. And even today, with tighter border controls, not just Germany, but the entirety of Europe is paying the dues, if you will, for this initial policy of open borders that let people in indiscriminately without proper procedures being in place. And for all of the positive elements, the positive impact that's laid at the feet of Angela Merkel, the migration issue is one that has tainted her legacy probably more than anything else. Also, during her tenure as chancellor, she faced EU institutional development and integration. She played a central role in shaping the European Union's institutional revolution. She oversaw Germany's role in the Lisbon Treaty implementation. She strengthened the European Council as the European Union's crisis management hub. She supported deeper integration in areas like banking supervision and fiscal oversight. Angela Merkel rarely pursued grand federalist visions. Instead, she practiced what she called the art of the possible, incremental, consensus-driven integration. Her foreign policy was a study on its own. She was a reluctant but essential leader. Germany under Angela Merkel became more assertive in EU foreign policy, though always cautiously, for obvious reasons. For instance, with Russia, Merkel led the EU response to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, pushing for sanctions and diplomatic unity. At the time, that seemed like the right approach. What we know now, in hindsight, is that Russia didn't respond to sanctions and diplomacy. And the lack of a forceful response by Europe, and specifically its most visible leader at that time, Angela Merkel, laid the foundation for continued Russian aggression throughout Europe, which laid the foundation, of course, for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Also, she dealt with China, and she advocated a balanced approach, an approach of economic engagement with strategic caution. On defense, Merkel supported gradual strengthening of EU security cooperation, though Germany remained hesitant on military commitments for obvious reasons. Her policy on Climate was one of ambition with constraints. Merkel was known early as the climate chancellor, and she pushed the European Union to adopt EU wide climate initiatives. And that led to some definite achievements. Germany's 2019 climate protection law set ambitious emissions targets. Merkel helped shape EU climate frameworks, though critics argued that she moved too slowly on coal and automotive emissions. She also, as I said before, faced Brexit during her tenure, and this led to a whole issue with EU unity. Merkel played a quiet but decisive role in maintaining the unity of the European Union during Brexit negotiations. She supported a firm but fair stance toward the United Kingdom, and her influence helped prevent divisions among other EU member states. If all of that wasn't enough, she also had to face one of the worst global pandemics in recent history in COVID-19. Merkel's final major act was supporting the EU Recovery Fund, a historic step involving shared European debt. This marked a major shift in Germany's long-standing resistance to debt mutualization. And many analysts view this as one of her most integrationist decisions. But even after Merkel, Germany remains the EU's economic engine, a central actor in climate policy, a cautious but essential leader in security and foreign affairs, a key player in migration reform, the EU's primary advocate for rule-based governance. Germany's influence is structural, not dependent on any single leader. Merkel put the systems in place and the mechanisms in place for Germany to not only lead from the front in Europe, but to maintain that leadership position. Angela Merkel's legacy in Germany and the European Union is defined by crisis management over visionary integration, stability over speed, compromise over confrontation, and preserving unity over pushing ideology. It's her pragmatic leadership style that helped both her own country and the wider European Union navigate some of the most tumultuous waters in its history. Angela Merkel's supporters see her as indispensable as a steward who kept Europe together. Critics argued that she lacked long-term strategic ambition. When Merkel's term ended in 2021, the Scholz era began. The new chancellor had a somewhat different approach to government. It went from Merkel's stability to fragmentation and value-based policy. Scholz believed in a more assertive foreign policy, especially toward China and Russia. The Scholz coalition emphasized a more Europeanized, value-driven foreign policy, heavily shaped by the Green Party and the FDP. This included greater assertiveness toward authoritarian regimes such as China and Russia. And this marked a departure, a pretty dramatic departure actually, from Merkel's pragmatic business-first approach. And this created internal coalition divisions, which weakened Germany's EU influence. The three-party coalition of the SPDs, the Greens, and the FDP struggled to maintain a unified line on EU issues. Disagreements spilled into Brussels on topics such as the EU Supply Chain Act, the combustion engine ban, and the Alternative Intelligence Act. These disputes reduced Germany's ability to act decisively within the EU, which was a contrast to Merkel's disciplined, consensus driven governance. Then came Zeitenwende, a major shift in security policy. After Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the Scholz government declared Zeitenwende, a turning point in German defense and security policy. But implementation lagged, and EU partners criticized Germany for moving too slowly on defense commitments. I remember many conversations I had with Ukrainian government officials that expressed not just impatience, but anger toward the Scholz government for moving so slowly in their support, in the country's support for Ukraine. By 2024, the coalition collapsed amid infighting, economic stagnation, and declining public trust. Analysts noted that Europe needed stability and strength, and Germany was providing neither. This further eroded Germany's traditional role as EU's anchor. And this led to the ascension of Merz as the Chancellor of Germany. Germany's political direction shifted again when Friedrich Merz and the CDU stepped to the leadership. Merz argued that Germany must move from a sleeping middle power to a leading middle power, prioritizing German interests even when they diverged from EU preferences. This was a significant departure from Merkel's EU first instinct. Merkel tended to do what was best for the whole, where Merz's focus was more on what is best for Germany. Merz had a much more transactional approach to EU policy, which emphasizes economic pragmatism, efficiency, and transitional diplomacy. Again, this contrasts sharply with the Greens' value-driven approach under Scholz and Merkel's multilateral consensus style. But Merz calls for an epical rupture, going beyond Scholz's Zeitenwende. He wants Germany to be more assertive, less hesitant, and more willing to lead Europe strategically. Merz and his allies argue that Germany underestimated the geopolitical risk and now must strengthen their defense capabilities, their technological competitiveness, energy security, European Union sovereignty, and other areas that will create a strong, sovereign, effective Germany and Europe. So, what's Germany's role in the world today? Its geopolitical posture centers on European integration, first and foremost. Germany is the EU's largest economy and one of its political anchors. Since reunification, its approach to Europe has been defined, as I touched on previously, by three core principles. Europe is Germany's strategic home. The EU is the primary framework through which Germany exercises its influence. Stability over ambition. Germany tends to prioritize cohesion, compromise, and incrementalism over sweeping integrationist leaps. It also values responsibility shaped by history. Its post-war political culture emphasizes restraint, multilateralism, and rule-based governance. This posture made Germany's EU position a strong one, as it became the de facto stabilizer, especially during crisis, such as energy transition, moving away from Russian gas after 2022, security, increasing its defense spending after decades of hesitation, migration, balancing the humanitarian commitments with political backlash, Its relations with the U.S., which have remained strong but occasionally are strained, especially by issues such as defense. And its relations with China, which are intertwined economically, but strategically cautious. Germany is no longer the aggressor of the 20th century, but it is also not the assertive power that some allies want it to be. It's a country that's still learning how to lead without fear of itself. In looking back, Germany's 20th century is both a warning and a lesson. It shows how quickly a society can fall into darkness. It shows how long it takes to rebuild trust. It shows that nations, like people, can change, not by forgetting, but by remembering. Modern Germany is not perfect, but it is one of the world's most stable democracies, precisely because it knows what happens when democracy dies. The story of Germany is a story of a nation that refuses to let its past define its future, but refuses to let it be forgotten. More than anything else, Germany is a country that has embraced profound joy, but also profound sorrow. And I've borne witness to both sides of that equation. The vestiges of that sorrow leading from World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, and the joy that came with reunification, and then with the economic and political resurgence after that. Really, Germany now is an integrated country. You can't tell the difference now between East Germany and West Germany. Some would argue that East Germany still lags somewhat behind economically, but it is a country that has been reborn and has rebranded itself in a different way. It learned from its past, and it realized that democracy was a pathway through this maze of challenges that it faced in the 20th century and into the 21st century. Germany today is a wonderful country to visit. It is a country that is so steeped in history that it's fascinating, but it's a country that is still, in some ways, suffering under the weight of its past. And one doesn't really realize that until, as I did, you're standing in Dachau, or you're standing at the Brandenburg Gate looking over onto streets that are now bustling with shops and banks and traffic and people going about their lives, but that once were virtually empty, were lined by rows of apartment blocks of people who could see freedom but couldn't have freedom, who looked at the wrong side of that wall that defined their destiny, that looked at this symbol of everything that could be on one side of the wall and everything that could not be on the other. And it's a sobering thought. One morning, I took a walk across the lawn of the Reichstag, which was Hitler's headquarters during World War II. And I looked around at other buildings of that era that the Nazis had built as monuments, that they built as manifestations of the of a republic that was so ethnocentric and egocentric that it thought it could define the future of Europe. Today, people are picnicking on the grounds, they're walking by fountains, they're going about their lives with little thought of what happened in the past. But even today, Germany's foreign policy, and to a certain degree its political approach, is defined by what happened in the past. So, I wanted to start this whole thematic area of times of joy and times of sorrow with the country that's seen both. One could argue that all countries have seen their forms of joy and sorrow. But Germany's joy and sorrow had ripple effects throughout the entire world. And I am very fortunate that I had the opportunity to look backward into Germany's history and understand somewhat how it got to where it is today, but also to work with German friends and government officials to look forward to see what Germany both is and can be in the future. That's all for today. Join me next Monday when we're going to jump into a new country under the theme Times of Joy and Times of Sorrow. Until then, have a great week. We'll see you next time on some stops along the way.